Welcome to Early Colonies Part 2. Now that you've spent some time looking at the individual colonies that you were assigned and learning about some of the others, we're going to learn about them as a whole. We're going to regionalize them and try to see what we can find out about each region, what's similar and what's different. So the colony breakdown. We like to think of the colonies in three sections or three regions: New England, Middle, and Southern. The New England colonies are Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. The Middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then the Southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. But for today's purposes, we're going to break it down even more. The New England and Middle colonies make up the North, and then the Southern colonies make up the South. Now looking at a map, what does this look like? And please make sure that you are filling out your map while I go over this, even if you have to pause it. So let's start at the bottom. You see Georgia bordering the Spanish border with Florida. And then there's South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, the small little red state, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York. And if you look at New York's borders, you see that it also engulfs Vermont, modern-day Vermont. At this time, it's all one state, part of New York. And then there's Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. But Massachusetts has two arrows, and please make sure you get this on your map. The top area is not modern-day Maine. It's part of Massachusetts at this time. This is a common mistake people make. Now this map is going to be important for tomorrow's quiz, so please make sure you have it written down. So now looking at these categories, North and South, let's find out what they're all about. For population, the North is made up of many different religions and heritage. There's Catholics, Protestants, Quakers, Puritans, also now known as Pilgrims, Jews, and many other religions. It's a diverse area. They also have the English, the French, the Dutch, German, Swiss. There are many cultures and religions mixed up in this area, and that's going to create some conflicts, but it's also going to help this area develop. Now, the population in the North is also mainly middle or poor class. They don't have a lot of wealth coming, which is going to help with their power struggles. They're going to be more united as a people than the Southern colonies. And most of the population are skilled laborers, artisans, and traders. They're the working class. In contrast, in the South, they're also made up of many different religions and social classes. Maryland was very wealthy. The Carolinas were more common farmers, but there are still wealthy individuals. And then Georgia, of course, was made up of the debtors. So you have the entire scale of social classes in the South. Now, the slaves also made up a significant part of the population in the South. However, when we think of slaves and slaves working on plantations, we tend to think closer to the Civil War. There's not that many slaves in the Americas yet. They're going to be coming in larger numbers in the coming years. Now land. In the North, there's very rocky soil, colder climate. We have all four seasons up here in the North, and that makes farming difficult. You're not going to be able to farm cash crops like tobacco or oranges. Instead, you're going to have to focus on plants that can take that type of weather, such as grains. Individuals in the North used the land for its natural resources, which they would then send back to England through a policy called mercantilism. And it was this idea that the colonists could only trade with their mother country, with England. So they would trade things like lumber, grains, specifically wheat, and fur. Fur trade was huge in this area, and the main fur traders were actually the French. But they would trade to the English colonists who would then send it to England. In comparison, in the South, they had a very warm, moderate climate, which allowed for long growing seasons. Because they had these long growing seasons, they could create more farming area and farm crops such as tobacco. In the future, they'll grow cotton. Now, the soil is perfect for these type of crops, which is why they're successful there and not in the north. And this is going to make it so the southern economy is much different than the northern economy. So speaking of economy, in the north, they focused on using the natural resources to collect raw materials, those raw goods, to then trade back to the mother country, again through this policy of mercantilism, which you'll learn more about Friday. What also helped the north is that they had a lot of ports to trade. Think about Boston, New York, even Connecticut, Delaware. They're all along the coast, and they have ports that can trade back to the mother country. The middle colonies were also the largest grain farmers in all of the colonies, even more than the South. So that's going to be a huge part of their trade. However, in the South, again, like I just said, tobacco was their main cash crop. It's going to be the main source of their money. They focus their economy all around farming on the land, on the large plantations. If you think back to the other night, you might have learned that these large plantations were given to the wealthy. If you could pay for your boat ticket over to colonies such as Virginia, then you would be given land to farm on. So people would pool their land together if they were family and create large plantations, which is why they needed the slaves. Now with all these cash crops growing, they're going to need somewhere to trade it out of, which became Maryland. Maryland became very wealthy because of this trade. So again, you have the wide diversity of social class growing. And lastly, the topic of slavery. Many people think because of what we learned about the Civil War that the North didn't have slaves, but that's not true. The North did have slaves. However, the slaves worked a little differently in the North than they did in the South, which is why we often forget about them. Slaves in the North worked more in the house as servants or on small farms. They might be seen almost as a nanny or an aide in a house. They're owned by wealthy families and some middle-class families, because remember, the North didn't have an incredible amount of wealth. In the South bought countless slaves through the triangular trade that came from Africa to the Caribbean and then up to North America. And these slaves worked on large plantations such as in the Carolinas, in Georgia, in Virginia. And they were used because they were cheap labor. So they were treated very poorly, and they were often traded or sold. As slavery began to be an even bigger source of work labor in the South, they're going to be traded and sold even more, with a desire to split up families so they don't try to run away. But at this time, slavery is just starting to grow in the colonies. Now, if you missed any notes, please make sure you go back and get them. And remember, you do have a quiz tomorrow. Please make sure you're studying the notes you have taken so far and the map you just completed. And I'll see you then.